1 Corinthians chapter 13. It says love is patient. Wow. It says love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. Love isn't rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. If love doesn't keep a record of wrongs, and if God keeps a record of wrongs, that means He doesn't love us. So many times in church life, someone will get behind the pulpit and make you feel as if you're wretched. They will make you feel sinful when you tell your kids, you're a wicked child. Is that good for your children? If I keep telling my child, you're wretched, you're wicked, you're not good enough to be in my presence, there's something really sick about that. You see, the Old Testament says that man is not good enough to stand in God's presence, but Jesus proved that wrong. Did God not come out of heaven and come right down here to planet Earth and sit down and eat with sinners? Did sinners stand in His presence, eat in His presence? In fact, Jesus, who is very God, He actually washed the feet of sinners. When my kids do wrong, should I resent them or help them? When you look at the Greek word aphiemi, which has been translated by the meta-language gloss, unfortunately, as forgiveness, it actually means simply to help that individual. For those God foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the likeness of His Son. How many people did God foreknow? Some or all? This is God. This is God who knew us from the very beginning. He predetermined something for people without asking them. That's what parents do all the time. We predetermine certain things to happen for our kids. I want you to look at this aorist tense chain that he uses here. And those that He predestined, He also called. And those He called, He also justified. He doesn't say, I justified them because they believed. There's nothing in this chain that indicates that I need to do anything but say thank you. Those God foreknew. He knew exactly what you would go through in life, and we should say thank God for that. I'm not catching Him by surprise. He knew that I would mess up. He knew that I would transgress. He knew that I would have
One of the things that I think that we have to realize from time to time is that we have stories throughout our Bible that need to be questioned. And I'm thankful for our guys working so hard and waiting on me this morning. We have been involved in some meetings beforehand. And my voice is pretty close to gone already, unfortunately. So, as I speak this morning, I may have to pick up a cough drop or drink some water, so just be patient. But I would like to talk to you about why we should be thankful. We have stories throughout the Old Testament that we have gone through over the last few years. And we have talked about whether these stories are actually moral, sane, and whether they needed to be treated even as God's Word. Now, we are making some progress there, but I don't think enough. And so I'm going to challenge, if you will, for us to rethink a couple of the stories actually in the Old Testament. And I'm hesitating for a reason, because we do not have all of our crew here yet, and we have various things that have to take place here in the studio. And so when we get everybody ready here, I will start actually teaching. And so please understand, the premise of what we do is to not put on a show for the purpose of entertainment, but we're here to put on a show for the purpose of intellectual honesty, scriptural honesty, spiritual honesty. I'm reminded of the story of Abraham. I want you to think about this story. Supposedly, God made this promise to Abraham. And the promise was, I'm going to give you a son. That's a wonderful promise. He has a wife. Her name is Sarah. They're expecting a son. And so they wait for many years, and they do everything that's necessary to produce a son. That's normally what married people do. They get together and they desire to have children because they love one another. But there's more to this story than just two people together. We have no evidence, that is in the Bible, that Abraham actually loved his wife. We have lots of evidence that would suggest that he didn't love his wife. So when we look at the story, here we have Abraham. He comes out of the Ur of the Chaldees. Now, please remember, back in those days, the Egyptians were very educated people for the most part. The Chaldeans were also educated people. But when we see the makings of the Jews, the majority of the Jews become these shepherd boys, people who simply tend the flock. And we're talking about the makings of a people who will actually wind up doing very little in the context of education. That's why our show tonight is going to be so important. We're talking about what Augustine experienced as a Jehovah's Witness. We're talking about religion discouraging people from learning. And this is why I want to talk about Abraham. This is a time in which we need to be thankful. And the reason that I bring this story up, I think that we can talk about this story and be thankful that we're not like that any longer. We have Abraham, who supposedly heard from God. He comes from a family of people who are actually somewhat educated, and they have certain practices that aren't necessarily moral. In fact, I would say they are extremely immoral, because Abraham, he has not just a wife, but the possibility of multiple wives. A man could have as many wives as he could afford. And back in those days, you had as many wives as you could purchase. So wives were simply chattel, if you will. And so when we look at Sarah, and I think that we need to concentrate on Sarah. She's just as valuable in the story as Abraham is. Abraham wants to have this son, and I'm not convinced that his intent is good. And it's certainly true that when you grow up in bondage, when you grow up in a cult, in a sense, that you're probably going to agree with that cult. And I'm not suggesting that Sarah didn't agree and go along with this kind of cultic mindset of being purchased and living in conditions like she did. But there's something about this story that troubles me. The thing about this story that really troubles me is that Abraham wants to have a son, and it's obvious that Sarah wants to have a son, but it's obvious that God doesn't want Abraham to be the father. They struggle and struggle to have a son, and they're trying to please God. And so, this conundrum is what it is. We're trying to please you, Lord. We want to have this son, the one you promised to us, and so you have a lot of effort being put forth, and not much is accomplished. And I guess my point is, in the story, we have Abraham growing old, and then we have God coming along after Abraham even tries to have a son through Hagar, and does have a son through Hagar. We're talking about one of Abraham's servants. Now, I want you to think about moral conditions back then. You're going to have a son with one of your slaves, a bondwoman. Maybe that will satisfy Sarah and Abraham. But God says, no, this is not satisfying here. In fact, the thing that I want you to do, Abraham, I want you to understand that your seed, your sperm, now sperm is the idea in Hebrew and both in Greek, because Paul records part of this story. So the sperm of Abraham dies, and the egg of Sarah dies. And there's something about this God who doesn't want Abraham to be the real father. And in another sense, this same God doesn't want Sarah to be the real mother, just the one who carries the child. And so in this story, we have both sperm and egg that dies. So God can be the egg provider and the sperm provider. It's like God says to human beings, you're not good enough. I want to recreate human beings in a different fashion. I can't work with you, Abraham, like you are. I can't work with your wife either. And please remember, just a few days before that period in time, we find that God had resented all of mankind and actually sent this flood and killed everyone but 8. So we have people recording the events, people writing various kinds of theology about these events, claiming that God really didn't want humanity to produce anything. God needed to get involved in the sex lives of both Abraham and Sarah. So just like with Mary, the story about Jesus and sweet Mary, the Virgin Mary, let's really emphasize the Virgin Mary, because God forbid that he allow Joseph to be the father of Jesus. And we're talking about a God who is so jealous that he will take his children and will not allow his children to have sex and actually have children and be pleased with those children. He can't come to grips with the idea of being pleased with Abraham supplying the sperm nor Sarah supplying the egg. And so the question would be, in this story, If you were the woman or the man and God says, no, I don't want you to supply the sperm, I don't want you to supply the egg, my question would be, how does that make you feel? When God starts jerking away, maybe I need to use a different word. When God starts taking away something that a man and a woman can do, and says, no, I'm not satisfied with your flesh. I'm not satisfied with your sperm or your egg. I'm only satisfied with mine. So here's the question. If a father took his son and says, son, listen, I know that your wife wants to be pregnant, but you're not good enough to impregnate her. I'm going to do it. And if he takes his daughter and says, you're not good enough to have the egg, I'm going to supply the egg for you. I'm going to get an egg in a different sense. For some reason, that really doesn't make sense. There's something about women and men, when they do have children, they have a sense of pride. They have a sense of saying, yes, this is part of me, this son or this daughter. And so when we read this story, it's like God comes along and says, I'm taking that sense of Abraham away from you. I'm taking that sense of Sarah away from you. There's something very disturbing about this kind of theology because it demonstrates once again that God is not satisfied with his own creation. He's not satisfied with his children. He wants to get involved in the lives of people and become their everything. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is a real God, but I'm suggesting that this is the kind of God that had been nuanced back in those days as being the very God that supplied all of their needs. And so I want to ask you a few questions. When it comes to Mary, is it important that she is this virgin? Is it important that God overshadows her and has sex with Mary so Joseph can't be the husband, or the father, I should say, of Jesus? There's an implication in both of these stories that implies that God can't do anything with us, who we are, because God refused to deal with the substance of who Abraham was, the substance of who Sarah actually was. He wasn't willing to deal with who they were. He had to intervene and shut down all of their reproduction, if you will, and say, I want to reproduce for you. I don't want you to reproduce after your own. I want to reproduce something completely different. Now, you're talking about a parent-in-law getting in the way, or a father getting in the way. I would suggest that this would be a good case scenario for an argument that a father or a father-in-law is getting involved in some business that they don't need to be involved in. However, in our theological circles, we praise God for getting involved in taking away the ability of the egg and also the sperm of both people in the story of Abraham and Sarah. Now, I said at first we're going to talk about being thankful. When the Apostle Paul says, think on the things that are above, What is he talking about? Is he talking about thinking about heavenly things? No, he's not. He's talking about and he's talking about in reference especially to himself. I've been raised, if I can paraphrase, I've been raised in theology all of my life. This theology of Abraham, Isaac, and yada, yada, yada. And it's about time that I started thinking above what that theology is. That's why he says, whatever is pure. Let's think and let's rise above all of that theology that we had in the past, and let's start thinking about ourselves in a much better way. We don't need God to come along and take the ability of me away so he can produce something in my life. The implication there is he's not satisfied with who I am. If he has to take my sperm or my egg away so he can do something, there's something really strange about that relationship. I hope someone's listening. I'm getting tired of all the magical waters of theology. They don't make sense. When I look and analyze both the Septuagint and the Hebrew text, these stories have major conflicts. And we have absolutely no proof that God actually said any of these things. But these people were carrying out a heritage that comes after the models of paganism, not the idea that Jesus expressed. I don't find Jesus getting involved in personal affairs, saying, let me take someone's ability to have sex and reproduce away so I can be the one who will be the daddy and the mama also. Now, who created this idea that Mary was a virgin? Not God. Who created this idea that Abraham and Sarah were not good enough to have a child and God to bless that child? I want you to simply to ask this question. If you have a child and God is not willing to bless that child, what is there about that God that's good? If God can't bless your children just like they are with your sperm and your egg, there's something wrong with that God. What do we have to be thankful for? Well, Jesus came along and he nudged us with love. What does that mean? If the story of Jesus is true, that is, the words of Jesus, not the information concerning his birth, but the information that he was giving to all of us through the means of other people, like the Apostle Paul. He says, love doesn't keep a record of wrongs. Love is kind. Love is gentle. God wasn't interested in taking away your ability to have a child so he could say, let me supply the sperm. Nor was he interested in taking away your ability to have a child. Let me take away your egg so I can be the egg for you. He wasn't interested in that. He was interested in meeting you where you were and telling you, you're good enough for me. You are my child. I'm proud of you. I'm satisfied with you. I'm here to satisfy that thirst. All of that past theology is crazy. It's built after models in which people were going out of their minds and they were going to extremes trying to satisfy. Sometimes they would actually slaughter thousands of goats and bulls just to satisfy this kind of God. And God says, let me tell you something. I've never been satisfied by the slaughtering of any animal or human being. This is why I'm so against the doctrine of atonement. It's not anything to be thankful for or about. I'm ashamed of the doctrine of atonement. God has to have some human sacrifice offered to him so he can forgive someone. He needs to get past himself if he's like that. He needs therapy. I'm talking about real thankfulness. I'm thankful for someone who nudged us in love 2,000 years ago. Jesus did come in the form of flesh. He wasn't ashamed of his flesh. And when it came to the Old Covenant, he did nothing but contest it. This is why when I read in 2 Thessalonians, chapter 4, verse 5, I'm going to read out of a meta language that may disturb you, but maybe I can clarify it so you will hear the voice of Jesus in these words. It is a clear evidence of God's righteous judgment that you will be counted worthy of God's kingdom. I really get sick and tired of the awkwardness of the read, because this is not how the Greek text is actually flavored, that is, within the context of its language flux. Let me read this again out of this English version. It is a clear evidence of God's righteous judgment. Now, first of all, when you look at the manuscripts and you look how Jesus states X, Y, and Z, that is according to a translation model that's in Greek, that is of his Aramaic, you're going to find that Jesus doesn't have judgment. I hope one day we start understanding that Jesus never judged in the theological sense that we talk about all the time. God doesn't have judgment. Jesus came along and presented God to be one who is like a physician. He looks at our sin not as sin, but he looks at our sin like a great physician would look at a sickness. He's interested in diagnosing us to help us. He's not interested in intervening. He's not intervening in this sense. He's not wanting to take away your ability so he can do it for you, so you can say, oh, this is not my son, but this is your son, oh, holy God. That kind of theology is repulsive. One of the things that I love about so many people today, my brother-in-law just had a child. He said, this is my child. And by the way, he's saying, this is my child, and I'm very well pleased with my child. But see, back in the days of Abraham, if you had a child, sometimes they would take their children out and actually throw them into the waters to please God. Their children were not valuable to them. Their wives were not valuable. Lives were not valuable. They would kill each other in a heartbeat. And I'm simply saying we need to be thankful that we live in 2012. And we have distanced ourselves from that kind of theology. You know, if you look at the story of Asa, for instance, if you didn't seek God, God would kill you. What an amazing theology. See, it's not just about whether you picked up on the, firewood on the Sabbath, you'd get stoned. God says in Chronicles, if you did not seek God, he would kill you. I'm trying to get people to make sense, be intellectually honest. Now, if God wants to help me have children, don't wait until I'm too old to deal with the circumstances. And you're not going to help me by saying, take away my ability to supply the sperm, and you're not helping my wife if you're going to take away her ability to supply the egg. There's something wonderful about my wife, and she feels the same way about me. And if my sperm and her egg are not good enough for you, you know what you can do with it. I hope some of you guys get an attitude about that old covenant. That old covenant and that kind of theology is crazy. We need to be thankful that Jesus came along to give us a nudge to move forward. Now, counted worthy of God's kingdom. If you're still worried about feeling worthy, You're still parked in that theology that says the wages of sin is death. And that's sad. There's something about that theology that will make you feel worthless, useless, wicked. It will make you feel like you can't even stand in God's presence. It will make you feel like your sperm is not good enough and your egg is not good enough. We need to be thankful that Jesus came along and said, you're good enough to stand in my presence. And he proved it that day by eating with the sinners, standing with the sinners, drinking with the sinners, getting on his knees and washing the feet of the sinners. He proved that God would do so. Worthy of God's kingdom. It's obvious in the text that Paul is stating that, yes, we are suffering, but there is this drum that's being beaten, in a sense, in this text that's disturbing still, even in the Apostle Paul's life. These people really don't feel like they're good enough for God. In many areas, the Apostle Paul says, yes, you are good enough for God, but yet at the same time, there's still so much of this Judaism in him. From time to time, he feels like he has to make this argument. Yes, we are in a sense worthy enough. We are worthy enough of this kingdom here, we're worthy enough. If I ever make my children feel like they're not worthy of my inheritance, I don't need to be their father. I'm not a good father if I'm going to make my children feel like they're not worthy to be loved, supported, protected. My children deserve my inheritance. They deserve everything that I have that's good, and they deserve nothing from me that's harmful. They deserve not to feel like they are not good enough to have their own children. I can't imagine being Abraham, not feeling like, my sperm's not adequate, God? Why? What about my wife? I mean, you're going to wait until we get real old to have a child so you can do this magic trick and make this magic nation called Israel? Wow. And then we're going to be your chosen people. Then we're special. We're the apple of your eye now. Everyone else is secondary. And then the first thing that you're going to tell the first king of Israel is to do this. Go kill the men, the women, and the children, and the infants of a particular nation. And then we're going to get into this killing spree theology. We're going to go from nation to nation to nation. And finally, we're going to arrive at a spot that you promised us, but we're going to have to fight our way into that, because it actually belongs to someone else. But we will kill people and possess the land and claim that you said to do that to the other children that you also have fathered. I hopefully this morning, and my speech is way off. You're just going to have to get past that. If you're a diabetic, you understand what I'm going through. There's a simple point here. Abraham and Sarah, if they had lived in 2012, and if they had been coming to the New Covenant group and been part of what we're doing here, they would have said, I'm not interested in, number one, having Hagar feeling like she's obligated to us in any sense. In fact, we're going to release her from her duties. She can go her way. In fact, Sarah doesn't need to feel so beat down. She doesn't need to feel like a purchased woman, like Leah and the rest of the women in the Old Testament. In fact, God, if you want to bless me, why don't you do this? Why don't you make my wife feel like she's the perfect woman with the perfect egg? If you want to do something for me, make me feel like my sperm is good enough for you. And so when my wife and I get together and we do have intercourse, make us feel like our son or daughter. We don't have to have a son. We can have a daughter. Be pleased with whoever we have. Why can't you be pleased with our children? My sperm, my wife's egg. Why can't you be pleased with that? Or are you so jealous and ridiculous and insane that you can't deal with it? Hopefully we can see that there were sick people back in those days pretending to be God, writing theology and saying, oh, God wasn't pleased with someone's sperm and someone's egg, and then God had to perform a miracle so he could be both daddy and mom. The same thing is true with Jesus, a miracle baby once again. Because God resented all of his children and continues to resent. And I'm simply saying that we need to be thankful for leaving that kind of theology and starting to rethink all of this and starting to be capable of saying to our children, please don't think like this. This is not sensible. It's not good. It's not healthy in any sense. As I stated before, the Apostle Paul says, think on the things that are above. Above what? He's not talking about going to heaven. He's talking about think on the things that are above reproach. What was this idea of reproach? That was actually the theology that he grew up in. He grew up in this theology that made you feel bad all the time. Parents who try to make their kids feel bad every time they do wrong, they've got problems. Let your children grow up. If they have problems, learn how to be a good physician and a good parent. Love them. Go through the problem with them. Enjoy them. Get them help. Take the load off of them. Do what Jesus did. He said, come unto me, all of you guys who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Give your children a break. Give them rest. Give them something good. Give them peace. Give them something that they can hang on to. Fill their hearts full of joy. Fill their hearts full of thanksgiving. Don't damn them and make them feel like their body parts and everything about them is not good enough and it can't satisfy you. Are you crazy, God? What's wrong with you? There's something about God that's crazy if he's like that. I'm just thankful that I don't serve a God like that. And I'm thankful that I don't serve God. God doesn't want me to serve him. Not in the theological sense. God doesn't want me to get on my knees before him and worship him. God doesn't want me to worship him any more than my mother and father want me to worship them. My earthly father never required for me to get on my knees before him and bow before him. But unfortunately, someone wrote a theology about every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess. Oh, something about the Almighty God. There's something crazy about that. I don't need to bow. I don't need to confess. I can't imagine my mother saying, confess me before men, or I won't confess you before someone else. I mean, who are we kidding? Who's crazy in the story? We're not talking about just one story. We're talking about all kinds of stories throughout the entire Bible. Now, I would argue that lots of this stuff has been mistranslated, but I would also argue that if we genuinely dealt with a better model of translation theory, a lot of this stuff is simply wrong anyway. Getting a lot of comments that are coming in. That's good. Keep commenting. I want to know your thoughts. Are you really one who wants to worship God? Why don't you get on your knees before God and cry out to Him, and maybe He will come to you and make you feel better. If you're tired of begging and pleading with God, give us a call, 850-572-7441, and speak reasonably. Does a good parent ever ask their child to get on their knees and worship them? Now, I know abusive parents do. They love all the praise, all the glory, and all the honor forever. That's what evil parents do. Let me replace that word. Sick parents do. Well, I needed Jesus to die to take care of my sins. I needed a perfect Jesus, one who wasn't born from a human being. That is, the sperm supplied by a human being wouldn't be righteous enough. That's the kind of Jesus that I needed. I needed super sperm. I needed God's sperm in a woman. And the woman can't supply the egg. She's too filled full of wickedness. I don't need magic Jesus to come along, because He's created out of magic sperm. I'm thankful for ordinary Jesus, the one who was actually born 2,000 years ago. He could simply look up and say, "Hey, Mom, Mary." He could look at Joseph and say, "Daddy." I can embrace that. I can't ever imagine anyone who would be so naive to think that we needed some magic spell cast upon this woman and some miracle to take place and say, "Oh, wow, now we have God with us." If I have to believe in that, I can't believe that God is actually in me. There's something about the wonder of God. He's capable of dealing with me as a human being just like I am. And if the words of Christ are right, and if the record and the recordings of Paul are remotely close to nuancing how God is, He's more than comfortable with us. In fact, I like what Jesus said. He said, "By the way, guys, when I leave, don't get upset. I'm going to send a comforter. You guys certainly need someone to comfort you. You've had hell all of your life. Your theology has created mental torment for all of you. You guys are afraid. You want to pick up swords and cut people's ears off. You've got problems, but I'm coming to you as a comforter. Why don't you become thankful? I don't need you to get saved, and I don't need another Jerusalem to be created. I wish you would get out of this Jerusalem and go into the mountains and start another life. You guys have been shepherd boys for too long. Why don't you think? I've been drinking with you. I've been eating with you. What's wrong with you? Can't you see who God is? Why do we have to use all this hyperbole? Why does God have to be this almighty one? Why does God have to be bigger than life itself? Why can't you just enjoy life for what it is? But you walk around in fear all of the time. This is part of your problem. You're afraid that God won't accept you. Wow. Therefore, you create these stories about the doctrines of propitiation. Oh, God is going to be satisfied when His Son somehow bleeds enough to satisfy the Father. That is how God gets satisfied. That's sad and sick. The bottom line is, this is how you satisfy God. Be yourself. You don't need to trust a sacrifice to satisfy God. Why? God is satisfied with you. He's been satisfied with you since before He ever created you. He created you for His good pleasure. He has been enjoying you ever since before the beginning, and yet we have failed to grasp that. Why? Because people have been writing theology. Wow. Maybe we need to start rethinking who actually said X, Y, and Z about how God is and how He feels about us. I think when we do, we will come to a more reasonable place. That is, in dealing with who He really is. For if Jesus represents God in any sense, He will feed you. He will heal you. He will bless you. He will tell you to love your enemies. He will tell you, don't think about doing eye for an eye theology. He will tell you, learn how to take it. In other words, don't resist an evildoer. When people do you wrong, don't repay evil with evil. Repay evil with good. Such a completely different philosophy, different theology. And so my question is, do you have a reason to be thankful? That is, just because you live in 2012. If you do have a reason to be thankful, because now we can think without condemnation. Back then, too much clutter, too much nonsense, too much distance, too many people isolated. You see, women back then, they couldn't get a hold of information. They couldn't walk outside of the borders of their tent, if you will. They didn't have access to the internet. They couldn't realize actually a world beyond their husband. They were trapped. But today we live in 2012 and we have the ability to go places and think and actually rethink and become logical. And maybe we need to be thankful about that. Get on the phone, 850-572-7441. Tell me what you think. I'd like to hear from you. Thank you for your time.